People think that money and finance and economics is about math, about numbers. But actually, remember I said it's not a hard science, but a social science, which means it's about people. People like you and me who make up retail investors. People who are the professional fund managers that are institutional investors. And it's people that we give the money to, who run the businesses, whether it's the companies or governments for that matter. And we, people, are human. We make mistakes. We have emotions. We can't do math in our head. So actually, money is about people. And we need to be mindful of the mistakes we make. Hi, I'm Hansi, and we're learning to be money mindful. Today, we'll discuss behavioral biases and what we can do about them. Let's start. The human brain is fascinating. We're still learning quite a bit about how it works, which means we don't really know what we're doing. But what we do know about investing, at least, is that we have two brains, metaphorically speaking, of course. One that thinks very fast and one that thinks very, very slowly. So sometimes we make snap judgments and then we justify it. So it leads to errors. Now, these errors are called behavioral biases. You might have come across this term before. You might have seen an article or a show about these behavioral biases. But it's important that we understand them. And to do that, let's group them into two. There's basically cognitive errors or biases. These are based on the way our memory works or the way we think. Within that, by the way, there's two different ones. There's belief perseverance biases, and then there's information processing. The belief perseverance biases are similar to, how we think that sugar causes our kids to go hyper? Well, it's now been proven that that's not the case. But in spite of this evidence, there are some people who believe that it does happen. Similarly, in investing, sometimes we are shown the evidence and yet we refuse to believe it. So these biases have names like they have cognitive dissonance, there's conservatism, there's confirmation bias, there's representative bias, there's illusion of control, and there's hindsight bias. So these are all belief perseverance biases. And then we have information processing biases. So these are things like anchoring, mental accounting, availability, self-attribution, outcome, and recency. And then there are emotional biases. So these are called loss aversion or ambiguity aversion. There's overconfidence, there's self-control issues, there's status quo bias, there's endowment bias, there is regret aversion, and there's affinity. Let's now dive deeper into some of these so you understand what we're talking about. Let's now read out some of these biases together. Illusion of control bias. This occurs when people believe that they can control or at least influence investment outcomes, when fact is they cannot. People who believe this always tinker with their portfolios, right? They're the ones, the trading types, they accept high risk. And confirmation bias. Confirmation bias happens when people seek out information that confirms what they already believe, and they discount any evidence that contradicts what they believe. Those types. Representative bias. Representative bias occurs as a result of flawed perceptual framework when processing new information. So to make new information easier to process, some investors project outcomes that resonate with their own pre-existing bias. So for example, a particular stock is seen as a value stock because it resembles an earlier value stock that was a successful investment. But the new investment is not a value stock. Availability bias. This occurs when people estimate the probability of an outcome on the basis of how prevalent that outcome has been to their lives. So these people easily recall the possibilities as being more likely than those prospects that are harder to imagine. This happens when mutual funds advertise heavily so that investors recall seeing that brand more often. So the framing bias is when we respond differently based on how a question is framed. So if something is framed as a gain frame, we may want it, whereas if something is framed as a loss frame, we may not want it, even though the outcome is exactly the same. Hindsight bias, come on, we all recognize this one. We all have been there where we recall that, yes, of course, we saw that coming, when fact is, at that time, we had no clue. So in 2008, for example, some people thought, of course, the housing crisis could have been foreseen. I saw that coming. Of course, they didn't. Recency bias. Recency bias is a predisposition to recall and emphasize more recent events and observations and to extrapolate these patterns when none exist. So recency bias ran rampant during the 2003-2007 bull run, when many investors wrongly presumed that the stock market would continue to gain indefinitely. So recency bias is when we are able to recall the more recent events and we forget the events from further back. Overconfidence bias. Overconfidence is another one that we probably all recognize. This is when we are much more confident than what the data suggests, because we think somehow we have special abilities. Anchoring bias. This is a good one. Anchoring bias occurs when we anchor an outcome to a particular number and then we adjust from there. So the simplest one is when we pay 100 rupees for something and the market go up and down, we think that we will not sell until we recover the 100 that we paid. Now, of course, the market doesn't know what we paid, so it frankly doesn't care. But somehow in our heads, we are anchored to that number. Another example is we are asked to guess, say, a market or a return, and then we're given an irrelevant number. It actually ends up biasing us towards that number. Status quo bias. Sometimes we just don't like making a decision and then that decision turns out to be wrong. So we'd rather have done nothing. We'd rather continue in the status quo than actually do something. In status quo bias, investors tell themselves that things have always been this way, this always been done this way, and they feel better when it continues to be in the same way. Loss aversion bias. In loss aversion bias, investors tend to feel the pain of losses more than the pleasure of the gains. This is a very common bias and is seen by almost every advisor. Self-control bias is when we are not able to control ourselves. This happens more in spending rather than investing, but there are some people who just can't control and trade very often. This is not an exhaustive list. There are many more errors that us humans make. We will provide a full list of these behavioral biases for you to read at your own leisure. So, how many of these errors did you recognize, either that you do or someone around you does? Well, until now, all we ever did was list these behavioral biases names and what their definition is, but we didn't do anything about it. But that is changing. The industry now believes that we can do something about them, and that's why we group them into cognitive and emotional biases. Based on their client interactions, these advisors realized that with emotional errors, clients don't take very kindly to being told that they're wrong. But with cognitive errors, they are much more open, especially if it's coming from a trusted friend or a trusted advisor. They're much more open to being moderated. So, with emotional errors, advisors adapt around the clients, and with cognitive errors, clients moderate these errors. In fact, some advisors observed that it's also a function of wealth. So the very rich, the ultra wealthy, do not take kindly to being told that they're making an error, so advisors adapt around them. Whereas mere mortals like you and me, might be open to being told that we're making an error because if we fix it, we can actually make more money. So given that we are not very rich, we are learning to be mindful about money, we think that we should learn about these errors and practice spotting them, and then work with somebody else, either a friend or an advisor, and see that we can go and fix them. Some advisors have also realized that there is a relationship between risk profiling, which we discussed in an earlier episode, personality testing, and some of these biases. So a certain type of risk profile and personality type is more prone to certain errors, while another profile is prone to some other errors. So what these advisors have started doing is adapting their reports to these personality and risk profile types. So for example, clients that are more likely to make emotional errors, the advisors mention emotional topics like staying on track, the retirement goal or security goal. Whereas those that make cognitive errors, their reports could be much more quantitative and much more numbers driven in terms of showing that these are sort of what the errors you're making. I told you people are endlessly fascinating, and our brains even more fascinating. So we learned today that we make all kinds of errors. We make cognitive errors in the way we think, and we make emotional errors, the way we feel. And the funny thing is that even after knowing about these for 25 odd years or longer, professors, professional fund managers, and even the Nobel laureate who wrote about these admits that they still make them. So there is no shame in admitting that we all make them. What we have to do is be mindful of them and let our friends and trusted advisors point them out to us and correct it. And if we do that, we will make hopefully more money. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Money Mindful and hope to see you next time. See you then.